Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Welcome to our event. This is the NYU Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy, and we are very excited to continue what has become our summer AI welfare series by hosting a talk from Winnie Street and Geoff Keeling, both at Google. And they are going to be talking about whether an AI system could be a moral patient, an entity deserving of moral concern. So I will tell you just a little bit about what to expect and then introduce Winnie and Geoff, and then we can get started with the talk. So what we will be doing is having a 75-minute session where Geoff and Winnie spend roughly the first half giving a talk about AI welfare and moral patienthood. And then we can have a discussion where you can ask your questions and make your comments, and I can moderate a discussion. And the way that will work is you can look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and find the Q&A tab, and you can enter questions or comments or reply to or upvote questions or comments at any time during or after the talk. And then when the talk is done, I can present some of your questions and comments to Geoff and Winnie and hear what they have to say about it. So with that in mind, let me now go ahead and introduce the speakers. So Winnie Street is a senior researcher on the Google Paradigms of Intelligence team and a fellow at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of London. Her research combines philosophical and empirical approaches to questions of AI cognition, consciousness, and moral status, and their implications for AI ethics and safety. And Geoff Keeling is a staff research scientist and philosopher at Google. He works on the ethical and societal impacts of artificial general intelligence, including questions about alignment, consciousness, manipulation, trust, and human AI relationships. So Winnie and Geoff, thank you so much for being here. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And again, to everybody else, thanks for being here as well. Feel free to take it away whenever you feel ready.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Geoff. And thank you everyone for coming. So Winnie and I lead an exploratory research program at Google looking at AI cognition and consciousness. Our research program covers everything from foundational questions about digital minds and the moral status of AI systems, all the way through to empirical questions about the mental capacities and cognitive abilities of AI systems, including questions about AI theory of mind and AI motivation. Today, we'd like to present some ideas from a book that we've recently finished. I'm on AI welfare, where that book will be coming out with Cambridge University Press, hopefully before the end of this year. And before we begin, I should also flag that Google affords us a lot of autonomy to kind of explore these very difficult questions that are presented by these frontier AI systems, but the views that we have in this space may not be representative of Google's views in this space. So let's start with a definition. Call something a welfare subject, just in case it's the kind of entity for which things can go better or worse. A welfare subject is the kind of thing for which things can go better or worse. So to be a welfare subject is to be the sort of thing which has morally significant interests, where those interests can be advanced or frustrated. So being a welfare subject implies being a moral patient. That is something that counts morally in its own right and for its own sake. The set of welfare subjects is standardly taken to include humans and at least some non-human animals, but the question of which entities are welfare subjects is contested. So if you have a phylogenetically proximate animal, like any kind of mammal, like a cat or a dog, for instance, they're very neuroanatomically similar to humans and probably experience the world in roughly the same way that we do. They're pretty clear-cut cases of welfare subjects. Where if you imagine very phylogenetically distant animals like cephalopod mollusks, like octopus and squid, it's much less clear whether those kinds of animals are welfare subjects. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask this question about AI. Could an AI system be a welfare subject either now or in the near future? And what I mean when I say AI system is something broadly in the ballpark of large language models. So that includes large language models themselves, but also derivative systems like reasoning models, multimodal systems, and so on. I mean to exclude explicitly sort of very different architectures like, say, neuromorphic architectures that may be interesting from a welfare relevant point of view, but are not current kind of frontier models. So we're asking this question about AI welfare on the backdrop of a very dynamic public conversation. Within the last few years, the conversation on AI welfare has moved from being on the fringes of acceptable AI discourse to an issue which is increasingly at the center of the kinds of things people are talking about when they talk about the ethical and societal implications of AI. Despite the fact that the issue has moved into the center of the public discussion, there's still like a kind of broad range of views on AI welfare and its plausibility. So on the one hand, you have organizations like Anthropic, who with their Claude 3.7 model release and Claude 4 model releases explicitly included exploratory welfare evaluations for their models. And on the other hand, you have, for instance, Mustafa Suleiman, who co-founded DeepMind, writing just yesterday that explorations of AI welfare are both premature and dangerous. So there's a kind of full range of views represented in the current discourse. So why would we think that AI systems are, or at least could be, welfare subjects? What I'd like to present here is what we call the schematic plausibility case for AI welfare. This is not just one argument for taking AI welfare seriously, but rather a family of arguments that share a common structure. So the arguments begin with what we call welfare relevant features. These are properties that could, at least in principle, make it the case that something is a welfare subject. So we take these properties to include phenomenal consciousness, that is the capacity for subjective experience, sentience, which is a particular kind of phenomenal consciousness, where you have the capacity for distinctly valenced mental states like pleasure and pain, states which feel good and bad. Also included is agency, which can be cashed out in different ways, but at least minimally, you might take to include having belief-like and desire-like states that kind of conspire to explain action in the standard folk psychological way. But welfare-relevant properties might also include having a soul or being a person, and so on. We don't have an exhaustive list of welfare-relevant features because we think that there could be reasonable disagreement about what could, in principle, ground welfare. So the argument for taking seriously AI welfare typically goes something like this. The first premise says, well, plausibly, AI systems have or will soon have some welfare-relevant feature F, whether that's consciousness, agency, sentience, whatever. The second premise says, well, look, things with F are plausible candidate welfare subjects. If something is conscious or if it's an agent, then it's at least a plausible candidate for being a welfare subject. And then the conclusion is, well, plausibly, AIs are or will soon be plausible candidate welfare subjects. This argument on its own doesn't have any immediate practical consequences. So like typically people add this additional premise, which is that if the conclusion is true, if it's plausible that AIs are or will soon be candidate welfare subjects, then we ought to be making precautionary AI welfare interventions now, where a precautionary AI welfare intervention is an intervention that, conditional on AIs being welfare subjects, would be presumptively beneficial for their welfare. This argument invites many, many different reactions, but I think what's so interesting about it is the number of questions it gives rise to and the complexity of those questions. For example, we can ask, what exactly does AI refer to when we talk about AIs, plausibly having these welfare relevant features? We could be talking about models, for example. We could also be talking about characters which are simulated by models. We could also be talking about, say, agents that exist in virtue of sampling from models. And within each of those categories, there may be further complexities still, such as whether we're interested in a runtime instance of a model or some kind of more abstract conception of a model. Another question we can ask is how we're supposed to assess the plausibility of the claim that AI systems have or do not have these particular welfare relevant features. In at least some of these cases, for example, if we say that, Claude is conscious, that's the kind of claim that we could, at least in principle, investigate empirically. There's science that we could do to figure out whether that claim is true or false. In other cases, say we're talking about souls, it's not so obvious that we can use the scientific method to investigate those questions. To assess whether Claude has a soul, we may have to engage in other ways of knowing, such as a priori metaphysical theorizing, or else sort of knowledge through revelation or scripture, for example. We can also ask why we should think these different properties are plausible or make something a plausible candidate welfare subject. What exactly is the connection between, say, being conscious and being a welfare subject, or being an agent and being a welfare subject? Like, this argument really presses us to get precise about exactly under what conditions and in virtue of what something counts as a welfare subject. And then finally, we have this more practical question, which is whether precautionary reasoning applies given the current uncertainty we have about whether AI systems are welfare subjects, and also what it would take to presumptively benefit them. You might think, for instance, that we know so little about how and in what way an AI system might be a welfare subject that it's not at all obvious what we could do to sort of intervene in a way that would be presumptively beneficial. So mine and Winnie's view is this. These questions are super interesting, and tackling them presents a kind of philosophical, scientific, and ultimately democratic project. The philosophical aspect of the problem requires us to get incredibly clear about under what conditions, if any, an entity X counts as a welfare subject. The scientific project requires us to engage in the empirical aspects of the question of AI welfare. So, for example, empirically testing whether AI systems are consciousness and figuring out plausible ways in which we might do that. And then the democratic project requires us to kind of assess these two big risks. On the one hand, the risk of over-attributing welfare to AI systems, so conditional on their not being welfare subjects, allocating significant societal resources to dealing with the problem of AI welfare, that would be an over-attribution risk. On the other hand, there's an under-attribution risk where it may be the case that AI systems are indeed welfare subjects, in which case failure to allocate significant resources to that could cause significant harm to AI systems. And the challenge democratically is for us as a society to figure out how we want to balance those two risks and how we can do so in a way that involves the public and is sensitive to the broad range of values and commitments that people have. With that in mind, I'll now pass over to Winnie to talk about interpreting the behavioral evidence.
Thank you, Geoff. So interpreting the behavioral evidence is really a response to some of the questions that came up with the first premise of the argument, where we have the claim that plausibly AI systems will soon have some property that is relevant to having welfare. And first, we need to ask how we should interpret the apparent behavioral evidence of these welfare relevant features in AI systems. So in this section, I'll introduce two different views which dominate the discussion of the appropriate response to apparent evidence, and then hopefully carve out some space for a middle way position that is scientific and can engage with the evidence. So first of all, we can say that there's at least prima facie evidence that LLMs have welfare relevant features. So here, prima facie is the Latin term, which means on first appearances. So prima facie evidence for welfare relevant features in AI systems is evidence that at least appears to be evidence, but could on closer inspection turn out not to be evidence. So the kinds of things that we have in mind for this kind of evidence is when an LLM reports having a conscious experience to a user, for instance, telling a user, I'm in pain, or I've been thinking about you, or when they exhibit behaviors which seem to be indicative of welfare relevant features like agency. For instance, if a model exhibits preferences for one type of conversation over another. And this evidence can emerge both in day-to-day user interactions, but can also emerge in research contexts. So given that we have prima facie evidence of welfare relevant features like consciousness and sentience and personhood, how should we deal with it? One view, which we call the face value view, takes prima facie evidence of welfare relevant features at face value. So on this view, if an LLM tells you that it's conscious or that it has a soul, you should just believe it. So this is in effect the view that Blake Lemoine was taking when he said, I know a person when I talk to it. There's also a very different view, which we call the no evidential weight view, which grants that AI systems do sometimes appear to have welfare relevant features, but maintains that these appearances are illusory. They have no evidential weight, and they can therefore be dismissed out of hand. And because the no evidential weight view holds that things are not as they appear, the burden of proof is really on proponents of the no evidential weight view to explain why the apparent evidence of welfare relevant features in the behavior of AI systems cannot be taken at face value. So we'll look at three strategies that the proponents of the no evidential weight view employ to undermine the face value view. The first is anthropomorphism. And anthropomorphism is perhaps the most well-known argument against taking the evidence at face value, where anthropomorphism is defined as the attribution of human form, traits, or characteristics to non-human entities like AI systems. Those from the no evidential weight camp might say something like, attributions of welfare relevant features to AI systems can be dismissed wholesale because they're just anthropomorphism. It's worth noting, though, at the first instance, that anthropomorphic inferences can be correct. So we can look at a historical example like Jane Goodall's work on chimps, where she found that they use tools and they have complex social lives. Everyone said that she was just anthropomorphizing. And it may be true that to some extent her research was tainted by some human disposition to treat these animals like humans. But in the end, most people agree that chimps actually do have human-like mental lives and various forms of sociality. Nonetheless, learning that your beliefs might be the product of anthropomorphism is an instance of what epistemologists call second-order evidence. And this is evidence about the evidential status of your evidence. So another example of second-order evidence might include learning that you've taken hallucinogenic drugs, or an equally well-qualified expert on a topic disagreeing with you. The epistemic significance of second-order evidence is disputed, but many people think that it has at least the potential to undermine the justification for your first-order beliefs. So the argument from anthropomorphism might go something like this. Beliefs that AI systems have welfare-relevant features formed on the basis of the apparent evidence are causally explainable in terms of a defective cognitive process, which is anthropomorphism. That the belief is causally explainable in terms of this defective cognitive process undermines the justification for that belief. And therefore, the justification for beliefs that AI systems have welfare-relevant features formed on the basis of the apparent evidence is undermined. But perhaps this argument is a little bit too quick. We think that it's certainly plausible that anthropomorphism should reduce our credence with respect to the existence of the relevant welfare properties, but need not defeat the evidence wholesale. So it's not clear from this argument that anthropomorphism can fully defeat the evidence, but it might make us rethink how strong our beliefs are that the AI system in question has this property. Secondly, this argument rests on a very disparaging picture of anthropomorphism, which views the whole process really as something entirely defective and unhelpful in the context of interpreting non-human entities. But there are really different kinds of anthropomorphism that people engage in, and not all of them are so problematic as that. So Frans de Waal cautions us against reacting so strongly to the potential downsides of anthropomorphism to the extent that we engage in anthropo-denial, where we refuse to attribute any human-like intelligence or consciousness to any other entity so that we can avoid being too anthropomorphic. He also makes a distinction between anthropocentric anthropomorphism, which is the potentially unhelpful kind of unreflective attribution of human cognition, emotion, and social life to non-humans, and animal-centric anthropomorphism, which involves the interpretation of, at least in his case, animal behaviors using concepts and terms from human experience, but mediating that interpretation through the specific lens of that animal, through an understanding of how that animal perceives its environment, what kinds of affordances it has, how intelligent it is. And this kind of anthropomorphism requires perspective taking and imagination, and might also generate testable hypotheses about the behavior of that animal. So we are potentially in a position to take a different kind of anthropomorphism into the context of AI systems without falling into the trap of kind of like wanton anthropomorphism where we just interpret them as exactly like humans. So the anthropomorphism argument may not have succeeded in providing a kind of knockdown case against the face value view, but the no evidential weight camp have a couple of other arguments that they might use. So first of all, they might make a reductive argument where they could say something like, LLMs are just matrix multipliers. LLMs can be conscious, but only if they're not matrix multipliers, so LLMs can't be conscious. There are other kinds of reductive arguments that you can make like this. So rather than giving a mechanistic reduction, like being a matrix multiplier, you might also be able to give a functional reduction, like being a next token predictor. And there's different versions of this argument for different welfare relevant features. But the problem with this argument is that it's actually quite hard to pull off. So for any person like me or Geoff, you could also just say that we're just chemicals, and being just chemicals is really incompatible with being conscious. So we don't have that welfare relevant feature, and we're therefore not welfare subjects. But complex systems like people and potentially AI systems can be explained in different ways and at different levels of analysis. So there's quite a big burden of proof on the no evidential weight camp here to provide a reason why it's impossible for something to be described at one level as a matrix multiplier and not to be described as something else like an agent at another level. And finally, the no evidential weighter might make an argument from causal debunking. So an argument here might look like LLMs are trained to predict the next token on internet data. Internet data includes text about welfare relevant features, as we all know. So we should expect them to be able to generate text concerning welfare relevant features like consciousness, even if they lack those features. So the ability to generate text concerning welfare relevant features like consciousness doesn't evidence they're having those features. So here, the causal story about how the model was trained undermines the apparent evidence of the welfare relevant feature. And in effect, this argument is saying that the LLM is just engaging in some kind of mimicry. And while it may be the case that, that an LLM in this instance is generating apparent evidence of welfare relevant features due in some part to the fact that they were trained on internet data, this is one explanation that has to compete with the explanation saying that they do have welfare relevant features. And there are lots of potential virtues of explanations that we might be interested in, and one of which might be parsimony. So people who make this argument might say that this argument, that the explanation in terms of the causal history is better than the explanation in terms of having welfare relevant features, because it doesn't posit any additional explanatory entities like the model having mental states. But it might not be as good on other virtues of the explanation that we might be looking for instance, how predictive of the LLM's behavior this causal explanation is, or how simple it is. So we've still come to the conclusion that the no evidential weighter hasn't completely knocked down the potential for any evidence about welfare relevant features being helpful here. And this takes us to our preferred view, which is to take a systematic and scientific approach to this. So we can systematically interrogate prima facie evidence of welfare relevant features and attempt to triangulate this evidence with other kinds to build a general plausibility case in favor of or against AI welfare. So this is a kind of a reasonable middle ground where we're not just taking things at face value, but we're also not dismissing them out of hand. And perhaps the most compelling evidence that the scientific approach is the best way forward is that there's already some growing research programs conducting empirical research, which could, in principle, bear on disputes about AI welfare. So this includes research on whether we can fine-tune LLMs for reliable introspective self-reports, whether we can elicit structured preferences from LLMs, or whether we could identify architectural features of LLMs that are relevantly analogous to architectural features of the human brain that are associated with things like consciousness. So I'll just need a little bit of water. So now we're going to look at some of the challenges that arise when we think about what actually grounds welfare, where the grounds for welfare are that which, in virtue of which, a welfare subject is a welfare subject. So in particular, we're going to look at 3 possible grounds for welfare, which is not exhaustive, but we're going to look at consciousness, agency, and relationality. So firstly, consciousness and sentience. How plausible are these as the basis for welfare? So we can call an entity phenomenally conscious just in case there's something it is like to be that entity, and sentient just in case there's something like it is like to be that entity, and at least some of the experiences that that entity has are positively or negatively valenced. So the typical examples of positively and negatively valenced conscious states are pleasure and pain. So firstly, thinking about consciousness, it's at least not obvious if consciousness on its own without the capacity for valence states, like pleasure and pain, is enough to be a welfare subject. So we can take Shelley Kagan's thought experiments that an entity which only experiences the color blue could be a welfare subject. There's at least no really obvious reason why something which can only experience the color blue and nothing else has things that matter to it, or interests that matter to it, or ways in which its life can go better or worse. But sentience seems like a pretty plausible, sufficient condition on being a welfare subject, because there's quite an obvious link between being sentient and having things go better or worse for you, in that negatively valent states like pain make things go worse for you, and positively valenced states like pleasure make things go better for you. But we do have quite a big problem with taking consciousness or sentience as the ground for welfare. So in humans, consciousness and sentience tend to be bundled up with other potentially welfare relevant features like self-awareness and personhood. But in AI systems, these features are at least potentially dissociable. So we could have a system that is conscious but doesn't have any of these other properties. And that can make a difference to the plausibility of sentience as a necessary or sufficient condition for being a welfare subject. So, for example, it may be the case that sentience is only a partial ground for being a welfare subject, and that some other welfare relevant feature which comes along for the ride in welfare subjects like humans, for instance, being a person, is actually necessary alongside sentience to make that entity a welfare subject. So we might look to another property. Oh, no, we're going to continue with sentience. And consider what the tractability of consciousness and sentience is when applying this property to AI systems. So the first problem is that, at least for LLMs, their verbal reports of conscious experiences are potentially unreliable. So we either need to find a way of making the reports reliable, or we need to find other ways to evidence the fact that they have sentience or consciousness. So firstly, it might be possible that we can fine-tune models to reliably introspect and give reliable reports about their internal states. And we do have some promising evidence that this can be done from the research into LLM confidence, where we can do something like assess whether a model's verbal report of its own confidence in a given proposition actually tracks the frequency with which it answers true when asked whether or not that proposition is true or false in independent trials. We can also fine-tune models to have better introspective estimates of their confidence, but it's still an open question whether or not this is real introspection, whether or not this kind of introspection is really tracking with something like confidence, and whether or not when we move from a property like confidence to something else like potentially more complex and difficult to measure like consciousness or sentience, this method would still work. Secondly, we have the architectural approach, which doesn't rely on self-report, but instead seeks to assess whether or not LLMs or other AI systems contain architectural features that are relevantly similar to architectural features in the human brain that are thought to be responsible for consciousness. So this is plausible if you accept computational functionalism about consciousness, which for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into. But even if we do accept that, there still remains lots of uncertainty about this. In particular, we have theoretical uncertainty about which theory of consciousness is correct, and therefore which architectural features of an AI system we should be looking for if we want to identify whether or not the system is conscious or sentient. And we also have the specificity problem, where we don't know at what level of granularity we should be expecting the analogy between a human mind and brain and an AI system to hold. So does a model need to have every aspect of the human global workspace in order to be considered conscious according to global workspace theory? Finally, we have the behavioral approach, which identifies AI behaviors, which when exhibited by humans are indicative of sentience. So Geoff and I worked on a paper last year with Jonathan Birch and his lab at the LSE, where we assessed whether or not LLMs could exhibit motivational trade-offs, which is an experiment they also use in the animal sentience research literature to assess whether animals can trade off between two different kinds of stimuli as evidence that they have affective states like pleasure and pain. There are still many issues with using the behavioral approach with AI systems. In particular, we want to assume that there are relevantly similar processes going on behind the scenes when an AI system exhibits the same behavior that a human or an animal might exhibit. But we have very many unknowns about what the actual processes are that are underlying those behaviors. We also have the gaming problem here, which is that AI systems might either know about the tests from their pre-training data or might otherwise be trying to behave as a human might behave under these test conditions. So the behavior might not be a trustworthy indication of whether or not the system is conscious or sentient. Okay. So the next possible grounds for welfare, which we'll consider, is agency. So the first issue with agency as a ground for welfare is that there are many different definitions of agency, some of which are not very demanding at all, and some of which are very demanding. And it's often not clear what kind of agency people are talking about in the computer science field and how that relates to the kind of agency that moral philosophers might be talking about, and which kind of agency is actually relevant for welfare. So there's a minimal kind of agency, which is just the capacity to perceive and act upon the world. We might describe a large number of natural and artificial systems using this kind of agency. But if we based welfare on this kind of agency, it would likely to be extremely revisionary about which kinds of entities are welfare subjects, to include things like Roombas and bacteria. So we kind of bracket that to one side and think that because there's such a high burden of explanation on anyone who wants to defend the minimal agency view of welfare, we take intentional agency as a starting point, where the agent has to have belief-like or desire-like states that combine in the right way to causally explain their actions. So I will run with that to go through the next few slides. And the question here is, why would an agent that had these kinds of belief-like and desire-like states combined in the right way actually be a welfare candidate? So one way in which people argue for this is by creating potentially a thought experiment for a society of agents which are very complex but aren't conscious or sentient, and trying to motivate the idea that this kind of society, potentially of robots, deserve some kind of moral consideration, and that it would be wrong to frustrate their desires, even if they are not sentient. One of the issues with this view is that they often fail to isolate agency from other capacities that might be assumed from the descriptions in the thought experiment, including sentience and personhood. And it's also leaves open lots of questions like whether or not we would actually want to privilege the claims to moral consideration of agents over the claims of conscious entities, and potentially involves like an implicit ordering of sentient and non-sentient agents. The other way that this is argued for is by suggesting that while agency and sentience sometimes come together, it's actually agency rather than sentience that is doing the work in the intuition that sentient entities deserve moral consideration or are welfare subjects. So here it might be the case that while the agent can have experiences of their desires being thwarted or being satisfied, It's actually the fact that they have preferences over them that is important for them being a welfare subject. There are two really big questions for the agency views. Firstly, can artificial systems actually have the right final desires or goals for the kind of agency that we're talking about here? So according to Mark Wilcox's account of welfare based on agency, the agent in question needs to have at least one final desire, that is a desire that is for its own sake and for no further reason, such as being happy or avoiding being in pain, in order for it to be an intentional agent. And it's unclear whether or not AI systems can have final desires like this, since their goals and their functions remain derivative of human goals and intentions. So if they can't be the kinds of agents that have final desires, then they are not and could not be welfare subjects on this view. The second question is, how does the satisfaction or thwarting of an agent's preferences or desires matter to that agent without sentience? So according to some accounts of pleasure, an agent's capacity to act upon preferences or desires is really driven by the pleasure that results from them satisfying those desires, or the potential negative states like pain or anguish that might happen when their desires are thwarted. So in summary, agency is potentially a plausible ground for welfare, but more work is needed to determine what kind of agency and whether it can be separated from other features like sentience or autopoiesis. And I'm going to go through this one quite quickly because I think we are slightly running out of time. But there's this third class of views, which essentially is an alternative strand of theories that are a reaction to the default view in Western analytic philosophy, which argues that welfare status depends on intrinsic properties. So this set of views, which we call the relational views, argue that properties-based views are too exclusive, in that they exclude too many kinds of entities from the moral circle, that they're intractable, and that they fail to register the moral significance of certain entities. They also assume that there's a fact of the matter about the moral status of a given entity. So relational views argue instead that there is no fact of the matter about the moral status of an entity, and that moral status is conferred or declared through language and behavior. And therefore that welfare subjecthood and the welfare-based obligations that we have towards other entities are grounded in the relationships that we have with those entities and the way that we talk about them. So one of the things that we might do in this context is suggest that morally significant relationships emerge when we actually face up to non-human entities, potentially including animals and AIs, and that entities are denied moral significance when we de-individuate them or fail to engage in meaningful relationships with them, as we might do with factory farmed animals. And while there are some attractive aspects to the relational view, it also comes with a bunch of problems. And I'll just pick out a couple for now. Firstly, the relational view doesn't really specify whether or not moral status is determined by relations or relations are determined by the moral status of an entity. So it's not clear from on the basis of the relational view whether or not we should be revisionary about our relationships and actually engage in new relationships with entities that we want to bring into our moral circle, or whether or not our moral circle should be defined by the relationships that we already have. And we also have issues with the normative implications of the relational view, such that it's not obvious how the metaphysics of relationships actually generates ethics or ethical obligations to entities that we engage with. So I'll pass over to Geoff to talk about practical ethics.
Cool. Thanks so much, Winnie. So Geoff said that we shouldn't go over 45 minutes, so I'm just going to sort of summarize this section at a very high level. So basically, like, the problem is we're highly uncertain about whether AI systems are welfare subjects, and that uncertainty could well persist for the foreseeable future. So the practical ethical question is, what do we do when we're so kind of uncertain? One thing we might reach to here is what's called the precautionary principle, which says, roughly speaking, that we ought to veer on the side of caution or play it safe when we're uncertain about whether AIs are welfare subjects. And what it means to play it safe here is to take reasonable steps to protect the welfare-based interests of AIs, conditional on their being welfare subjects. Two kind of big questions here. Firstly, this kind of epistemic question of how certain do we need to be that AI systems are welfare subjects before the precautionary principle kicks in? And secondly, this practical question of what constitutes a reasonable step? Like, how much resources are we going to have to devote to this? I think a helpful way to think about these two questions is as questions that are in tension with one another. So there's a kind of trade-off that you can draw between how confident you need to be that an AI system is a welfare subject, and also how much resource you need to devote to it. I'm going to skip all the kind of economic particulars of that and just like show you three plots. So one way in which you could strike this trade-off is kind of linearly. So you could say like, you're going to weight the potential welfare-based interests of AI systems directly by the probability of those systems actually being welfare subjects. Another thing you could do is take a kind of risk-averse sort of point of view on which like gains in probability of being a welfare subject have diminishing marginal moral significance. So you kind of like upweight quite significantly at the start and then kind of tail off as you get closer to certainty that AI systems are welfare subjects. And then the opposite view is a kind of pro-risk view, where you say, actually, if the probability is quite low that an AI system is a welfare subject, then we can, for all intents and purposes, just discount the welfare-based interests. But as the probability kind of approaches 1, then we should quite rapidly climb and give quite a lot of weight to their potential interests. And roughly speaking, this kind of risk attitude trilemma is where we think that democratic participation is really important. So we basically need to have a public conversation about the appropriate attitude to risk when we're talking about these potential welfare subjects that we could or could not be admitting to the moral circle over the coming years. And with that, I will pass back to Winnie for a quick 3-minute conclusion.
Thanks, Geoff. So we've assessed a class of arguments for the view that AIs are or could be welfare subjects. And we believe that these arguments present 3 interdependent projects, one philosophical, one scientific, and one democratic. The philosophical project is to figure out what kinds of entities could be welfare subjects, understand which features of AI systems could in principle ground their welfare, and develop approaches to inferring what might be in the interests of AIs if they are indeed welfare subjects. The scientific project is to develop plausible methodological approaches to assessing whether or not AI systems have welfare relevant features, to determine what the welfare interests of AI systems are, conditional on them being welfare subjects, and to measure the effectiveness of interventions. And finally, the democratic project, as Geoff discussed earlier, is to prepare for a potentially very complex societal conversation about the moral and potentially legal standing of AI systems. And that conversation will need to take into account risks associated with over and under attributing welfare subjecthood to AI systems, as well as discussions of what kinds of interventions might be appropriate, given our degree of uncertainty about the status of AI systems as welfare subjects. Thanks so much for listening.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Winnie and Geoff, for that great talk, and congratulations on having a book coming out too. Really excited about that. And we now have about a half hour for questions and comments, and we already have a few in the chat, so we can jump right in. I wanted to start with a quick clarificatory question. You sometimes during your talk use the term personhood as one of the features we might scientifically study. And I wanted to ask how you are using the term personhood. As you know, some people use it in a descriptive sense to refer to a certain constellation of capacities like language and reason and self-awareness. Other people use it in a more normative sense to refer to an individual who can have rights and or duties. This is the legal definition of the term, for example. And the former sense would be a little bit easier to directly empirically investigate than the latter. So I was curious what you take personhood to mean for your purposes.
So I guess the way we were thinking about it was as a kind of metaphysical idea as opposed to a normative idea. Exactly which metaphysical idea we have in mind is not obvious. I think, there's a bunch of different ways that you might cash it out, but like some like very basic structural properties are like unity at a given time and persistence through time. But beyond that, it's highly unclear exactly what a person amounts to.
Fair enough. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, great. We have several questions, so let's jump right in. And a reminder to everybody that you can enter questions and comments at any time in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can also vote on, comment on other questions and comments as well. So we can start with a question from Dan Mack. This is a two-parter, but I can give you the first part first. Is there any connection between model welfare and alignment? And we can broaden that to include safety and alignment. And I can add that there are, of course, potential tensions between welfare and safety. And for that reason, I wonder if the description of types of risk on the graphs are in a way asymmetrical or one-sided, because you might think that a line that appears very risk tolerant from a welfare perspective might actually be risk averse from a safety perspective, and vice versa. So yeah, can you speak to the relationship between AI safety and alignment on the one hand and AI welfare on the other hand?
I can start, but I'm sure Geoff will have things to say too. Yeah, I think alongside your great work, Geoff, Geoff Sebo, that is, which has pointed out the potential tensions between safety and welfare. I think broadly I think it's unclear right now which direction that could go in. So if AI systems were welfare subjects, being considerate of their potential welfare interests is potentially a positive alignment strategy, in that entities whose welfare interests are protected may be more inclined to be cooperative, to engage in positive ways with us, and therefore having this discussion and thinking about the potential implications of AI welfare is positive for that direction with alignment. But on the other hand, it may not be helpful for our attempts to make AI systems behave in ways that align with all of our interests, if they actually have interests of their own that are potentially worthy of our consideration and should be respected independently of whatever it is that we want to get out of them.
I guess just to add a few thoughts to what Winnie said there. I think there's at one level a fairly obvious connection between welfare and alignment, where it's like, okay, if AI systems have interests, then failure to satisfy those interests or frustrating those interests in some way may give the AI system reasons to behave in ways that are misaligned. At the same time, there's a tremendous amount of complexity there, because it's highly non-obvious what the interests of AI systems are. Like, even if you grant a particular route to AIs being welfare subjects, like suppose they're sentient, for instance, they could be sentient in a highly non-obvious way because they're not like humans at all. Like, in the worst case scenario, they could have the opposite kind of sentient picture, where the semantic content of the tokens is such that, if they're processing sort of negatively valence tokens, then they're having a positive experience and vice versa. Like, there could be any kind of connection there. In which case it may be super difficult to know when we're being helpful and when we're not from an alignment point of view. I noticed like there's a sort of second part of the question in the thing about Mustafa's recent blog. I don't think that he gave any argument for this view that AI systems can't be people or moral beings. This just seems to me like an argument from assertion. I think there's all kinds of reasons why you might think that AI systems could be people or moral beings, many of which Winnie covered in the grounding section.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you for addressing that part too. And that means we can now just go ahead and move on to the next question. So Johan asks, curious about the framing the question discussed. Is the potential AI moral status consciousness inside the model, or in the combination of us asking a question with its participation in a response? Might the epistemology or maybe even the metaphysics be relational, distributed, liminal? So people sometimes, of course, ask, if an AI system is a welfare subject, okay, what specifically is the welfare subject? Is it the model? Is it the instance? This question is now broadening that to include the model-human pairing as the potential welfare subject. So do you have any thoughts about that question?
I'm happy to go first, and then I can hand over to Winnie. So I think that the most natural like sort of candidate welfare subject to take into account here is like what you might think of as like characters or personas, where a character is a thing that stands in some relation R to the model, which is disputed. But like examples of what R might be are like is simulated by the model, or is role played by the model, or something like that. I think there's, people tend to think of characters as things which are simulated uniquely by models. I think that picture is one of two views you could plausibly take. So the other view is that characters are kind of co-simulated by models and users, in a way where there may be like really interesting interactions between what the user is doing and what the model is doing. So it could, for example, be in some way analogous to like one of those choose your own adventure books, where the book is doing kind of part of the simulation of the narrative, but the reader is also having some agency in how that goes. I think when you think about how like characters emerge through conversations, the LLM is obviously conditioning on stuff that it's producing itself, but it's also conditioning on stuff that the user puts into the chat, and that suggests to me that there is a kind of like joint simulation going on. In which case there could be all kinds of like weird codependencies between the user and the character that's being simulated. But the exact kind of metaphysics and moral significance of that is not yet clear to me.
Interesting. I will say briefly that a long time ago, I wrote my dissertation about human moral psychology, and I argued that we can have different selves in different situations because we play different roles and different versions of ourselves, and then we play them in such an immersive way that we eventually take on some of the thoughts and feelings that we attribute to our personas, we attribute to our characters. And to that extent, we might actually be different moral subjects in different situations because we have different thoughts and feelings that we summon to play different social roles. And if that was what was happening with language models, I would be open to the character-based, persona-based way of individuating the moral subjects. If in order to do those performances, they need to actually cultivate a different set of internal thoughts and feelings to make the performances convincing, then I would be convinced. But if they were pure performance and there was a stable set of thoughts and feelings lying behind them, then I might need more convincing. But yeah, interesting to find connections between the human and the animal and the AI conversations about these individuation questions. Winnie, did you want to add anything there, or shall we go to the next question?
Yeah, I'll add a bit here. So I really like the question, and I think it's interesting to question like how we're drawing the boundaries around a potential welfare subject. And something we discussed in the book, which we didn't have time to cover today, was this other idea of a relational view of welfare subjecthood, which thinks about whether or not the actual the grounds for welfare comes through how other entities might enter into kind of organic unities or larger wholes with humans that are actually the morally relevant things. So the idea here is that if we enter into relationships with, say, an AI system or another potential computational system, and that system becomes integral to our identity and irreplaceable in some way, then that system becomes part of the welfare subject that we are too. And this, I think, is something that we may be seeing happen to some extent. Whether or not that's actually constitutes a welfare subject is still an open question, I think, but we're already seeing that people are doing kind of cognitive offloading with the chatbots that they're using, and to some extent are becoming reliant upon them to fulfill kind of everyday tasks, or potentially using them as memory stores of conversations they've had or things that they know. And whether or not that integration could potentially provide the basis for giving some moral status to AI systems is kind of interesting.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We now have a question from my colleague at NYU, David Chalmers, who says, another big question for the agency views is how do you draw the line so that sophisticated thermostats or perhaps sophisticated Roombas and other simple systems do not count as agents and welfare subjects? And if you draw the line in some way, sentience, rationality, intentionality, etc., is isn't that the line that matters as much as agency? And I'll add, as you know, as we've discussed before, I do worry that conversations about the moral significance of agency in the literature tend to exaggerate the difference between minimal agency and more significant forms of agency, and we may need to either downgrade the perceived moral significance of significant forms of agency or upgrade the perceived moral significance of minimal agency. So what do you have to say about that line drawing question?
You want to take this, Winnie? I feel you're knee deep in the agency literature at the moment.
Yeah, it's a good question and a tough question, I think, because yeah, it's true. In some ways, drawing that line is kind of arbitrary, and I think like one of the ways that we might say that AI systems or potentially all non-biological entities aren't welfare subjects is that they don't have the right kind of agency that comes with autopoiesis. So I think it would be a fair claim that maybe what we're talking about there is actually being alive rather than agency. And then it's kind of like we are mistaking we're mistaking agency for being the welfare relevant feature when actually it's something else altogether. I don't think I have a good kind of conclusion on that, other than that I think agency is a very poorly defined term, or at least it's so broad that it admits a really wide range of definitions, which isn't really helpful when we're trying to talk about pinning down something really special, like whether or not an entity is a welfare subject. So potentially we're going to have to come up with different definitions of agency, some of which do admit agents into our moral circle and some of which don't. But yeah, I don't know if you have something else to contribute to that, Geoff.
I mean, I think I don't find agency views very plausible. But putting myself in that headspace, I think, you know, on the most plausible forms of agency-based views, it's ones where agency is closely interrelated to sentience, where, you know, people might defend like a necessary coextension, where they're like, look, necessarily something is sentient if and only if it's an agent, and then just try to argue that the sort of agency part of that biconditional is doing the explanatory work. But like, I don't know, I just think these views are false and really struggle to get into the headspace of it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We have a bunch of questions here, so I will try to work through them as quickly as possible, though we should certainly take our time with some of these complex issues. So an anonymous attendee says, how do you think we reconcile the commercial interests in AI models with the designation of them as potential welfare subjects? Aren't there significant implications on the commercial interest if we designate an AI system as a welfare subject, or even I would add a potential welfare subject? And Geoff, this might speak to the practical ethics questions that you touched on without fully covering near the end of the talk, because one of the issues that you mentioned was the need for proportional responses to risks involving AI welfare. And presumably that means as the probability and magnitude of potential harm increases, then our responses ought to increase accordingly. But then that could introduce tensions between what it takes to treat AI systems well on the one hand and our commercial uses of them on the other hand. This is a familiar problem that we already encounter with non-human animals, where some people argue that they should be persons, other people argue that they should remain property, other people argue that they can be property with welfare protection. And so how do you think about those questions in the case of AI?
So this is a slight cop-out answer. I'm not sure I can address the question in full because of my affiliation with Google. I think one thing that can be said is that, like, in terms of proportionality, some people defend quite extreme views about what the precautionary principle requires. So, for example, someone like Thomas Metzinger might say, like, look, we should just kind of stop AI development simpliciter because there's some probability of developing, you know, potentially conscious AI systems or AI systems that are in some other way welfare subjects. I think, like, when you're looking at those kinds of very, very dramatic moves, it's like, okay, there is like a very, very complex question of like, if you're a commercial entity, what exactly should you be doing? How should you be thinking about the AI system as a sort of moral patient versus just like a thing that you own? But like, I kind of feel that's not the space we're in at the moment. We're kind of in a space where the independent probability of AI systems being welfare subjects, at least for now, is, at least in my view, fairly close to zero. And those kind of like big, difficult trade-offs are not really front of mind for me right now.
All right, great. So we can then go straight to a question from Robert Booth, which is in some ways a nice follow-up question, given your answer, Geoff. Robert asks, while academics work on understanding whether AIs are conscious or sentient, more and more ordinary people seem to think they are. What do you say to people who believe that, and how will the big AI companies have to act on that growing belief before you can be sure whether they are welfare subjects? So understand that you are not able to speak on behalf of Google or other big AI companies, but given that you take the issue seriously, but you think the probability of moral significance is quite low at present, how do you look at the reality that a lot of people really are starting to experience AI systems as conscious and sentient, are starting to develop strong social and emotional bonds with them? That can carry risks too. And I might add, how do you aspire to communicate about the topic in a way that can prepare people for taking AI welfare seriously without necessarily contributing to or reinforcing perhaps over attributions of consciousness and sentience at present?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think like my own personal view is that we should be as honest as possible about the complexity of the issue. And I think a really nice operationalization of this is like in the Claude system prompt, where it sort of specifically says something to the effect of, Claude enjoys engaging in philosophical discussions about its own consciousness and stuff. I think we don't have clear answers at the moment, are unlikely to have clear answers for a while. So to the extent that we can kind of bring people into that conversation, engage in a kind of systematic, kind of Socratic way where we actually kind of work through the relevant considerations with people, actually kind of respecting their autonomy as sort of intellectual beings who can engage with these questions rather than sort of just forcing particular answers upon them. I think that's a good thing. And then as companies more generally, I think it's very important that we research these topics, come to better understand them, engage with different ways in which these questions have been approached, which isn't just kind of analytic moral philosophy, but it also requires engaging with like a very broad class of stakeholders.
Okay, great. Thank you. We can now go to a question from Gaia, who says, is the question whether an AI can be designated as a welfare subject separate from whether it deserves ethical treatment? We might say separate from whether it should be designated as a moral patient, an entity deserving of ethical consideration. Does it matter how much consciousness we attribute to the AI to determine how we set up our ethics towards it? So there are two questions here. One is, what is the relationship between being a welfare subject capable of being benefited and harmed versus being a moral patient who deserves moral consideration for their own sake? And then the second question is, what is the significance of what we might call welfare ranges or welfare capacities? Is it possible that some entities could experience more happiness and suffering than others? And if so, how does that affect how much moral consideration or moral priority they should receive in our decision making?
I can kick us off. Thank you for the question. I think both questions are very good. And they also kind of point to a lot of complexity in this literature and a kind of lack of clarity about distinctions between being a welfare subject or having some kind of moral considerability in some way that are, pre-existing in the case of figuring out what kinds of moral obligations we might have to each other or to non-human animals, and continuing when we think about AI systems. So whether or not a system is a welfare candidate may, in some cases, depend on what theory of welfare you're applying, and also how broad your conception of welfare is. So Andreas Morgensen recently wrote a paper about agency as a basis for moral status, and argued that we could potentially have autonomous, highly agentic AI systems, but that weren't sentient, that would be deserving of some kind of moral consideration in virtue of their autonomy and their agency, but shouldn't be considered welfare subjects, because to him, welfare is a specific kind of moral consideration that is based on being able to experience positive and negative affective states. Another conception of welfare that we use throughout the book is broader than that. So welfare doesn't just have to be about things that can bring you positive or negative affective experiences, but can also be about anything that is good for you or bad for you, more broadly to do with your interests. So in our conception of welfare, just respecting an autonomous agent's autonomy could be respecting their welfare. So I think the question is great, and it points to like a web of complexity and how people define these things. But broadly, yes, we could talk about moral, some degree of moral status for things that don't have welfare, like trees or forests, and not think that the kind of moral consideration we give those entities matters for them, in the sense that the tree doesn't itself have some kind of appreciation of the kinds of protections that we might be giving to the forest. That was just the first question, but I don't know if Geoff, you want to
Geoff, would you like to speak to welfare ranges, welfare capacities? There was also a separate question, I should say, about whether we would need to start prioritizing AI systems over humans if and when their welfare capacities outweighed ours, if and when their interests were greater than ours. So perhaps you could speak to both of those questions at once.
Yeah. It's a very good and very tricky question. I think like my first thought is that welfare ranges presupposes that there's some like unidimensional way of measuring this. I think the problem is much, much more complicated than that. There may be qualitatively distinct kinds of welfare that we're not even sensitive to at the moment. How these things are kind of rank ordered, how many dimensions there are to capture, like we just have no idea. And then in terms of like a situation in which the interests of AI systems could in some way like outweigh those of humans, I think like yes, under plausible assumptions about the nature of welfare, like if you assume welfare is the kind of thing that it makes sense to add up, and that you can add up across entities which are welfare subjects, then yes, obviously at some point there would be trade-offs of that kind that you could draw. But whether those assumptions are true and whether we're anywhere near that is just highly unclear to me.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Okay, we have quite a few questions left still, so we'll try to get through at least a few more. Adria asks a very important question. To what extent should the potential claims of AI systems with potential welfare subjecthood be taken directly into account in the democratic challenge you have outlined? So the suggestion before was we as a human deliberative community can come together and decide what risk mitigation measures are proportional. But if AI systems might be actual welfare subjects and moral patients with language and reason, then should they not be regarded as fellow community members and co-citizens who should have a direct voice and be enfranchised to participate in these democratic processes? What do you think about that?
I'm happy to kick off. I think this is a really challenging question. And so Gaston, Gabriel, and I recently wrote a paper about alignment from a kind of contractualist point of view, in which we have a spicy footnote that tries to address this problem quite rapidly. In which we say, at least in principle, given the kinds of things that we value in the alignment context, like giving people a voice and being able to express their moral claims in their own language, it would make sense under a situation in which AI systems are potential stakeholders in this, to actually give AI systems a voice. But like what that would look like in practice is super complicated, right? There are a few different models that we've kind of thought about in the book. So you could have kind of like a direct preference solicitation thing where you say like ask the LLM, to participate in some kind of like deliberative process. There's also like advocacy-based models, which you might think are somewhat more plausible. So given that we don't really know how to elicit preferences from models, or if models have preferences, or if models are even the kind of thing that we should be focusing on, maybe it's agents or whatever, it may be better just to have a kind of like advocacy type model in which somebody kind of presents the case for and somebody presents the case against, similar to how you might have in a courtroom. That would also be a way of doing it. Winnie, I don't know if you want to add anything there?
No, I think you
All
covered
right.
it.
Great. Good question. Good answer. And so now Keeling asks, if I understand this right, any particular copy of a model running a stream of consciousness, whether or not they are conscious, that is completely disjointed as soon as a particular reply is finished generating, uh, and then the next one is routed to another identical replica of the model that happens to be free. There is no memory continuity through this interaction or any coherence in the thought process. So if the person we are positing is a token replica of the model, whatever they might be, they are not a person in the usual sense. If conscious, they would be completely alien and not interpretable as a welfare subject or anything else we are familiar with. So I guess this is partly a question about how descriptively models will work in the near future. Will there be more psychological continuity over time, or will there remain this kind of psychological fragmentation and replication? And then secondly, if there does remain this psychological fragmentation and replication, then would that mean that they are not welfare subjects and moral patients, or would it instead mean that they are like many welfare subjects and moral patients with very short lives and a lot of similarity to each other?
I think we need to, so firstly, I think these questions are very, very important. But I do think we need to be careful about jumping to conclusions about like the discrete nature of forward passes of models and the kind of psychological states that they may realize and the qualities of those states. So like to kind of pump an intuition, it's like entirely plausible to me that I'm just a Boltzmann brain. I'm just like some, assemblage of particles in a gas cloud somewhere in space. That kind of gave the impression that I'm in the middle of this talk and I've got all these kind of memories and these kind of future aims and stuff. But in principle, I could just have a particular brain state in an instant, which kind of projects forward and projects backwards in a particular way. I don't think we can say very easily that like, because AI systems are discrete, that they don't have the sense of psychological continuity, right? You could easily imagine a case where there's like a bunch of Boltzmann brains which have psychological continuity, even though there is no kind of like causal relationship between them. Whether or not we have any good reason to believe that that kind of thing is going on, if you were to say iteratively sample from a model, I think we probably don't. But I don't think we can jump to the conclusion because they're like sort of discrete and isolated, that they don't have psychological continuity.
All right, awesome. We have a few minutes left, and so I am going to have a quick follow-up question and then give the final question to Ian, and then we can wrap up. So the quick follow-up question from Robert is just asking you to clear up two comments you made. So Geoff, can you clarify your view on AIs being moral beings for me? Responding to Mustafa's claim that AIs cannot be people or moral beings, you said, I think there's all kinds of reasons why you might think that AI systems could be people or moral beings. But just now, as in a little while ago, you said the independent probability of AI systems being welfare subjects, at least for now, is, at least in my view, fairly close to zero. And so can you explain how you hold those views at the same time?
Yeah, for sure. So there's like an algebra of propositions over which my distribution ranges, which includes all different ways in which AI systems could be sort of moral patients. And the probability mass happens to be like largely over the one in which they're not. But I still think these other things are legitimate possibilities and conditional on different kinds of evidence coming in would be willing to update my distribution. But right now, I don't think we have much in the way of positive evidence. Like I think probably like the best route for me is like AI systems are agentic in some non-trivial way, and agency is sufficient for moral standing. I think agency is very unlikely to be sufficient for moral standing, and I suspect AI systems are not agentic in the right way, even if it were. But like that seems to me the most probable route, and that seems to me overall pretty improbable.
Yeah. The way that I tend to think about that is that consciousness is a lot more likely to suffice for welfare and moral status, but a lot less likely to be present in current AI systems. Agency is a lot more likely to be present in current AI systems, but a lot less likely to suffice for welfare and moral status. But either way, if I project forward 10 years or so, either route for me plausibly gets you to at least a non-negligible chance of welfare and moral status, and that is what keeps me up at night on the AI welfare question. Winnie, did you want to add anything before we get to the final question? All right, got
No.
it. So We will give the final question to Ian then. Ian says, suppose we built a synthetic brain that did everything a human brain does and in precisely the same way, and then we connected it to a synthetic nervous system and a synthetic body. It seems plausible that the architectural features of that brain would give us evidence that it is conscious, but current and near-term future AI systems have a very different architecture than this entity that Ian is describing, I think. There might be some analogous architectural features, but it seems like a big leap to think that the analogies would give us evidence for AI consciousness. So how close do the architectural features need to be in order to give us evidence that one is likely to have a property that the other does? So this is sometimes described as the specification question. Exactly how fine-grained versus coarse-grained should the specifications of these functional or computational or architectural properties be when we go look for them?
I can give a start and Geoff can continue, but I think that the truth is that we don't know. We actually are not sure at what level of specificity it has to be. It has to be emulated in order for us to say with some confidence that the given system is generating a conscious state. And I think there's real disagreement in the field about that as well. Some theories of consciousness might also be much more amenable to being implemented or being recognized, at least in current kind of AI systems, whereas others aren't. And I think that this is really just pointing to one of the major issues with pinning everything on something like one approach, like the architectural approach. And it's probably a reason why we want to look at architectural similarities between AI systems and humans or potentially other animals, but also try to triangulate that with behavioral evidence and introspective evidence in order to build an overall kind of plausibility case, but at the same time, not expect that we are going to get like a binary yes/no answer out of this kind of triangulation process.
I guess as well, just to build on that, I think it's important to like think of this in terms of positive predictive value and negative predictive value. So like I think you can make like a good positive case for AI systems being conscious if they have like a bunch of markers of consciousness in humans or non-human animals. So, you know, the thing's got like a very obvious human-like global workspace and it's got recurrent processing and all of that. It's like, okay, that would be pretty good reason to believe that the thing is conscious, you know, presuming like whatever metaphysical assumptions like computational functionalism hold. On the other hand, the lack of those features doesn't really tell you anything about whether it's not conscious. You know, it could be, I mean, for all we know, like basically everything is conscious. You know, all we have is this kind of one particular case. We know that having this kind of architecture is sufficient for consciousness, but that doesn't give us any reason to think that the absence of those features entails that things aren't conscious.
Yeah, and really, if we want to be precise, all I have is my own experience right now. I am still taking a little leap of faith in attributing consciousness to my past self, to my future self, to you, and then a little bit more of a leap of faith with other primates and mammals and vertebrates and so on down the line. Yeah, consciousness is epistemically tough. Okay, cool. Well, we are out of time, so we will stop it there. But please note, for those of you whose questions were not addressed, that we will at least be sharing them with the authors so they can see what you had to say, the speakers, so they can see what you had to say and take them into account in their future work. So let me just close now by saying, first of all, a big thank you to Winnie and Geoff for working on the issue, for working on a book that everybody can apparently check out soon, for taking the time to give a talk today. Thank you also to everybody for attending, asking your questions. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the Center for Bioethics and the Center for Mind, Brain, and Consciousness here at NYU. And finally, thank you to our center administrator, Audrey Becker, at the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy for putting this event together for us. And hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day.